It's okay. All right, friends. You asked for it. You got it. Let's go fully online, digital live for a full regional lecture on the Middle East, aka the Middle East Mayhem, a region that is complex, complicated, at the center of so many other global issues that it probably would take me like 50 lectures to do it properly. But for our class, what I'm going to do is try to break it into at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 different sections so that I don't bore you to death lecturing for 10 hours straight for starters, but also so that we can break them up so that you can do some flash quizzes on them as well. So let's go ahead and get to the meat and potatoes of the Middle East. A region that is important, quite frankly, whether you like to pay attention to global politics and global economy and global stuff or not. Because your country, that is you Americans, your government is heavily invested and heavily involved in the Middle East and has been for some time. Why is that? Why is this place the center of conflict and controversy, and the United States is somehow involved there, even though we don't really live there and we're not from there? What's going on with the Middle East? Well, let's head to the Middle East and talk about it. Now, for starters, as we head to the Middle East, let's start to talk about where is it we're talking about. Now, everybody kind of knows. The Middle East is kind of one of those terms that everybody accepts and says, of course, the Middle East, that place over there, somewhere near Africa or Europe or Asia. Yeah, so let's tack it down. When we're talking about the Middle East, typically, everyone on the planet would agree that the countries that are in the core of the Middle East are those countries on and surrounding the Arabian Peninsula. So for starters, who's in the Middle East? From a sovereign state perspective, the entire Arabian Peninsula. That is the Saudi Arabians, as well as Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, all of those Gulf countries, but of course also Iraq and Iran. And let's throw in Syria, and Lebanon, and Israel, and Egypt. Everyone would agree that's the kind of classic old school core Middle East. However, let's expand it a little bit further afield, because for our class, and most people in the world would probably agree with this too, the Middle East, this kind of nebulous bigger region, would also include all of North Africa. Really everything from maybe Eritrea, parts of Ethiopia, through Sudan to Libya, Chad, Niger, Algeria, all the way over to Morocco and Mauritania. Now, some books in some places would also include Central Asia as part of the Middle East. I think that's pushing it a little bit too far. Most other places also count Turkey as part of the Middle East. I don't count Turkey as part of the Middle East for reasons that I'll make clear as we go through this. So really, for our class, we're looking at a broad swath, and this is a big region from Iran sweeping through the classic Arabian Peninsula, Middle East, all the way over North Africa to Morocco. Okay, that's the places that we're talking about. And of course, with the regional definition that we always try to define as well, what's homogeneous about this area that's different when you go to other parts of the planet? Why wouldn't I include Turkey? I don't think it's homogeneous enough. I don't think it shares enough factors with all of these other Middle Eastern countries that I've talked about. I don't think Central Asian states do either. And what's very obvious when you're looking at the Middle East is that when you go further south into Africa, when you get into sub-Saharan African states, they're wildly different, radically different. Radically different in all ways, from ethnicity, the way the people look, the color of their skin, their culture, their religion. Everything's different once you cross through south through the Sahara. So this whole North Africa, core Middle East, all the way over to Iran, these guys have a whole bunch of stuff in common, homogeneous traits that we can identify, and let's do that in our first little mini lecture here. Before we get to those homogeneous traits, though, what is the Middle East? We all recognize the term, but it's kind of a confusing term if you start to pick it apart. Middle East. Well, the middle typically means you're in the middle, right? But how can you be middle of an East? And where did this term come from? I think maybe most of you have an instinct about this, that this is a European-derived term. The people in the Middle East have never thought of themselves as being in the middle. Or perhaps they've never really considered themselves Eastern. But Europe, the region, mostly Western Europe, that controlled most of the planet for the last 500 to 600 years, they're the ones that in their height of power define the rest of the world according to them. So if the Western Europeans are the center of the planet, they can then say, well, there's stuff that's slightly east of us, the Near East. Oh, there's stuff that's way far east of us. That's the Far East. See how it works? And if you're not quite near, but not quite all the way far, then you must be somewhere in the middle, thus the term Middle East. So Europeans, over the course of the last 5 or 6 centuries, have defined the Near East as those countries that we would kind of say Turkey to Eastern Europe up to Russia. They would say that's the Near East back in the good old days. The Far East, obviously, are those countries that are way far east of them. China, Japan, the kind of classic Southeast Asia. That's far east of the Europeans. And that leaves, of course, the Middle East smack in the middle of those other Eastern things. It's, again, a term that makes not a lot of sense in today's world because the Europeans aren't in charge of the world. And they're not the center of the planet anymore. But old habits die hard. So it's a term we all still use that is of European origin that everybody kind of accepts. Okay, let's talk about it physically momentarily as well. When we're talking about the classic core Middle East, Egypt all the way through the Arabian Peninsula up to Iran, and of course I've now already pointed out that I'm going to count all of North Africa as well, but just looking at the classic Middle East to give some scale to this, the classic core Middle East from Iran to Egypt really covers most of the continental United States, about equal in size, about equal in latitude as well. So they're very different climates for reasons we're not going to discuss in this class, and size-wise about the size of the continental United States. Now when we shift over to North Africa, we're talking about a vastly bigger chunk of change. So just looking at the North African part of this region, the entire continental United States would fit tidily, easily, nicely inside of just the Sahara Desert. And the Sahara Desert is one of these physical things that helps define the region. It's a gigantic, huge, big desert. It's the biggest hot desert on the planet. Feels like a side note, possible exam question. The biggest desert on the planet is actually Antarctica. Deserts are defined by how much rainfall falls, not by temperature. So in terms of it gets less than 10 inches of rain a year, Antarctica is actually the biggest desert on the planet. The Sahara is the next biggest after that. And it's the kind of classic, it's hot there too. So a classic hot, huge desert. Sahara, biggest hot desert on planet Earth. And it does help define the region by dividing the Middle East from the rest of the African continent. And it is a big expanse of true, full-on desert that not a lot of people live in. It's tough to cross. Therefore, it's a good boundary or a good dividing line. Now, thinking about the Sahara in and of itself, as Noel pointed out on this map you see, you could fit the entire continental United States into it. Hell, you could probably squeeze in Alaska around the edges. This is a big, big place. And again, this is just the North African part on top of the classic Middle East. So you're looking at almost 2 United States side by side in terms of area of the place that we're talking about here. Now, let's talk about what unifies this region. What are the homogeneous traits that we want to look at and think about that are different once we go to Turkey or Europe or Central Asia or India or Sub-Saharan Africa? There are some things that when we think of the Middle East, a lot of keywords pop into the mind. And in large part, they're pretty true. The things that we think of the Middle East, as generalizations, they're generally pretty much spot on for 95% of the time. However, even these broad generalizations that are pretty solid have some major exceptions. And I will now point out some of these homogeneous traits and the major exceptions that apply to each of these factors. So when you think of the Middle East, do this. Don't just be a stagnant listener here. Play along with me. What do you think of when you think of Middle East? If I said Saudi Arabia, or Egypt, or Morocco, or Algeria, or Iran, what pops into your head that would be the same in all those areas? Now, again, this is a recorded lecture, so I can't hear your answers, but I'll bet a bunch of you said, oh, well, it's dry. You just finished talking about the Great Sahara Desert. I did. And this is a dry area, and it is a homogeneous trait virtually across the entire place. It is a dry place. From Morocco all the way over to Iran, hell, going into Pakistan, it's a pretty dry and arid place. I've now already told you that a true desert is a place that gets less than 10 inches of rain a year. To put it into perspective, Blacksburg typically gets about 40 inches of rain a year. So true desert, less than 10. In some places of the Middle East, much less than 10 inches of rain per year. And this does affect the climate. It defines the climate. It defines the terrain, the way things look, the way people live and act and what they eat. So I do want to point out a couple of things as you look at these pictures, that when we say the word desert, it's not necessarily a homogeneous thing. And what I mean by that is, yes, it is a homogeneous trait across the whole Middle East that it's pretty dry. But the term desert is not necessarily homogeneous in that it's sand dunes. That is the classic image of, oh, it's just waves and waves of mountains of sand for thousands of miles. Not really. You can have sandy deserts. You can have rocky deserts. You can have deserts that are a combination in between. You can have deserts that actually may have some short grass or cacti. But the point I'm making is that there is a variety of landscapes across the Middle Eastern deserts as well. And as we pointed out, the Sahara is the largest hot desert on the planet that dominates all of North Africa. Dominates! Again, we live in the 21st century. We as humans like to think that, oh, we just do whatever we want, and we can counter Mother Nature whenever we want and build stuff and overcome physical challenges. Yeah, that's kind of true, but sometimes Mother Nature still gets the best of us. And these deserts are so severe and so big in the Middle East, they're not easy to overcome. They do affect human lifestyles and human choices and how many people can live there and how many resources are available to the people to be able to live there. So when we're looking at desert, I want you to also be thinking of, hey, that really affects lifestyles and population totals. So you don't have big population totals in major parts of the Middle East. Typically the core areas of the Sahara Desert. They're just too dry. Humans got to have water to live, and if you don't have water, you ain't living there. So big swaths of North Africa are mostly uninhabited or very lightly inhabited, maybe 2 or 3 people per square mile. But also the Arabian Peninsula itself has big chunks of full-on hardcore desert. Not all of it, okay? Most of it's arid, but only a few parts of it are hardcore, like, whoo, nobody lives there. There's a part of Saudi Arabia, in southern Saudi Arabia, one of the deserts is called the Ruba Kali. You can go look it up. The translation is the empty quarter. Why would they call it the empty quarter? Because it's empty. Because nobody lives there. There's not hardly any plant life, much less humans trying to find that plant life. So there are big deserts across big chunks of the Middle East. The Saharan Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Ruba Kali. There's also the Tar Desert, the Lut Desert. This is an arid place. And of course, we've already picked out the Sahara and the size comparison to the United States. Let me go back to that slide there. Just think about this. The continental United States fits inside the Sahara Desert. Think about getting in your car on the east coast of the United States and driving to California. And now, put it in the context of, you just did that in the Sahara Desert. And you would be seeing true full desert, sand dunes or rocky desert, the whole time you were in the car. 3,000 miles of full desert. That's hardcore. It's big, too. However, let's get to the exceptions, because not all of the Middle East is full-on sandy dune desert. Nobody can live there. No plant life, no humans, no water, no nothing. Because if that was the case, there'd be nobody in this region. And there actually is something like 550 or 600 million people here. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but let's go ahead and throw it out as a possible test question. Look it up on the population chart, but I believe the region has about 500 or 600 million people. And here's the thing I want you to know. Their population is growing. The Middle Eastern population is one of the regions that's the fastest growing population-wise. It's not the biggest. You know, China has the biggest population, and India is growing, and it will soon supersede China and have the biggest population. But the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa are the fastest growing population regions that we're talking about in this class. So a lot of people there, 500 million people is nothing to sneeze at. So they must be living somewhere, and they must be living somewhere that's not full-on desert, and they are, because there are exceptions to this rule. The general rule that, yes, the Middle East is dry, true. But there's this place that maybe you remember from, vacation Bible school back in the day called the Fertile Crescent. Anybody remember the Fertile Crescent? Well, if you're going to be fertile, you probably have to have some water there, and indeed, in this kind of boomerang shape you see on the map, there's an area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, two historic famous rivers, where Western civilization actually started. So the kind of fringe southern part of Turkey, what's now Syria, Israel, all the way over into Iraq and Iran. This is the cradle of civilization, and it was the cradle because it's a fairly well-watered place. Because of these two great historic rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, that empty out into the Persian Gulf right there at the head of Iraq. So the Fertile Crescent has water. There's some desert there too, but it has big rivers. In fact, Turkey has a whole bunch of rivers that empty into the Tigris and Euphrates. Turkey has a bit of a power play it can put into effect in the area, in that it could close off those headwaters anytime it wants and control water flow into classic Middle East. It's another reason I don't put Turkey into this region, by the way. Turkey actually doesn't really have desert, not like the rest of the Middle East does. But the Fertile Crescent, there's lots of crops and stuff that are grown there, and has been for thousands and thousands of years. And in coastal margins, I do want to be quick to point out that the kind of classic old school Mediterranean style climate predominates around the Mediterranean Sea, from whence the name Mediterranean climate comes from. So all along the coastlines of Egypt, Libya, Algeria, but also Lebanon, Israel, Syria, the coastline that Syria has, is kind of classic Middle Eastern climate, and that would be akin to what they have in southern Spain and southern France and Italy. We don't really think of those places as arid dry, because they're not. So Fertile Crescent, classic place that has some water. The fringes of the Mediterranean, classic great civilizations with this Mediterranean style climate. But I do want to point out on this map, and this is a map of precipitation in the Middle East, that there are some places that you typically don't think have water at all, that I haven't mentioned yet. Places like northern Iran. Northwestern quadrant of Iran is quite well watered. There's grasslands and forest up there. And this stretches through the Zagros Mountains, which is a mountain chain which runs between Iraq and Iran, mostly in Iran. And they're pretty high mountains, actually. I think some of the high peaks are 15,000, 16,000 feet. I think they have skiing industry there. It snows in western Iran. People think, what? Iran? Snow? Skiing? Yes. They're very dry in interior Iran, and eastern Iran is kind of classic dry, arid desert, but not the northwest, and not in the Zagros Mountains either. So there are some big exceptions here to the rule. What else, though, popped into your head when I said, what homogeneous traits are there? What do you think of when you think of the Middle East? So maybe you said it's a desert, but maybe the second thing you thought of is they got oil. And almost everybody, that might have been your number one, by the way. Everybody's like, oh, Middle East, oil, Middle East, oil. Middle East, what do they got, Middle East, oil? Where do they make Middle East? Oil. What do they export? Oil. What do they drink? Oil. Okay, that's taking it too far. They don't really do that. But, yes, we always think of oil. The entire world's oil supply must exist in the Middle East. Well, not necessarily, but yes, they do have a bunch. The map I've shown you earlier in this class is a map, it is an ancient map, but quite frankly, it hasn't changed a whole lot. A global movement of oil on a daily basis. Daily basis. That's every day. And every day, according to the width of the line, it shows the flows of oil in the world. The width of the line is how many millions of barrels per day move from one place to the other. What this map shows, and why I continue to use this map even though it's old, probably 20 years old, is that you can very obviously see the pattern that the Middle East is one of the, if not the, major export regions of oil on planet Earth. That for sure is true. To put it in context a bit, lots of places produce oil now. Lots. Russia's producing tons of oil. You know that Venezuela is a major oil exporter. So is Nigeria. The United States and Canada actually produce a hell ton of oil. So does Mexico. But a lot of these places use most of their oil. And a lot of these places export oil, but not at the amounts that the Middle East does. So in the future, just to give you kind of a heads up about what's going to happen for the rest of your life after I'm dead and gone and worm food, the likelihood of oil in the future of our entire planet is that you're probably going to live to see some countries end up having more than some Middle Eastern countries. What I mean by that is right now, Saudi Arabia, hands down, has the most proven reserves on the planet. Everybody's like, oh, Saudi Arabia, oh, the whole thing's made of oil. They have the most oil on planet Earth. Yes, for now. But as technology increases, as oil exploration and production and processing gets better and better and better every year, not only do they find more oil, but they figure out ways to process it better so they can actually extract more of it. And the technology is getting better so that you can go further out to sea and get it in deeper areas and get it out of different types of rock like oil shale that we didn't used to be able to economically do so good 50 years ago. Bottom line is, the Middle East, right this second, is the biggest exporter of oil on a daily basis. Okay? Fact. That may not hold true forever, and it may not even hold true that they are the biggest holder of proven oil reserves for much longer. Let me name just a couple of places to you that maybe I want you to know. The United States, for all the oil we use, we actually produce a ton of oil. But we're such oil gluttons, we use all the oil that we produce, and then we have to import a bunch more on top of that. This is stuff maybe you already know. So the U.S., lo and behold, is actually a pretty big producer of oil. We use all ours. Canada and Mexico are big oil producers. Russia is increasingly becoming a big oil producer. And we talked about Russia last week. You know Russia's a major exporter of oil too, but not at the same rate as, say, the Middle East is yet. Other ones I do definitely want you to know, Brazil. Brazil may be, in the future, bigger than even Saudi Arabia or Russia in terms of proven oil reserves. This is early. It's an early call, but they're doing a lot of cutting edge deep sea exploration off the Brazilian coast. And all of a sudden, just in the last couple of years, people are starting to say, "Holy mother of Rio, we have a hell ton of possibly a hell ton motherload of oil in some deep sea drilling off the Brazilian coast." So that's another one to watch. All right, sorry to get off track talking about oil, but of course, oil is the energy du jour. It's the energy type of choice that runs the global economy. It's why it's so damn important. And thus, bringing it back to our topic right here, that's why the Middle East is so important. They may not be in 100 years. They might not be as important in 100 years if other places are producing way more oil, but right this second, the Middle East does produce and export more oil than anybody else. Again, the key word here is export more oil than anybody else. We'll see how much longer that takes effect. Now, there are some geologic reasons behind these facts, and that is that the Arabian Peninsula, well over 100 years ago, well, about 100 years ago, when people started exploring and people started using oil as the major fossil fuel, the major energy fuel, period, lo and behold, found a wellspring hell ton all across the Arabian Peninsula. And I do want to point out that this is one of the reasons that OPEC formed up as a kind of Middle Eastern phenomena, even though there are other countries that are OPEC members. But OPEC started, and the core of OPEC is Middle Eastern countries. Why? Because they have had so much. For 50 or 60 years, they have the most proven reserves. That is, they have explored, they've looked, they've mapped it, and they're like, yep, we know we have 100 trillion barrels of oil in Saudi Arabia. I'm making that number up. I don't know what the number is. But we have 100 trillion barrels of oil in Saudi Arabia, proven. It's not guesswork. We don't think, we know. There might be more in other places. And Russia may end up having more than that. And Brazil may end up having more than that. But they haven't proven it yet. Does that make sense? So proven oil reserves are heavy, heavy, heavy in the Persian Gulf Basin, in the Arabian Peninsula. And that's why OPEC's major players, and maybe you do want to kind of jot this down, are places like Saudi Arabia, the king of oil, but also Iran and Iraq and Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates. These guys have tons of proven reserves, and they have had tons of proven reserves for decades. And thus, they formed up their little OPEC cartel. And OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. There, I've used that word again. Exporting countries. I'm telling you, other countries are going to end up having more oil in the future, but the Middle Eastern countries are the greatest exporters of oil. Thus, their importance in the global economy. These guys really can set the price of oil. In fact, I shouldn't say they can. They do. That's what OPEC mostly does, is set the price of oil. And you set the price according to how much they all think they're going to produce every day for this month and for next month and projecting ahead to next year. These core countries, just the ones here in the Arabian Peninsula and around the Persian Gulf, can say collectively, okay, Iran, how much oil are you going to produce next month? Okay, well, Saudi Arabia, we're going to do this, and Kuwait, you're going to do this much. And given the totals of how much oil we're going to produce, we can say that we're going to set the price at $98 a barrel. And that's that. And the rest of the world can say, damn it, we don't want to pay that. But nobody has a choice. They set the price of oil. That's the way it works. Make sense? And again, let me add this in. There are other countries in OPEC. Venezuela is an OPEC member. Indonesia used to be an OPEC member, but they dropped out. Nigeria is a big oil producer, and it's an OPEC member. None of those other countries, though, have the clout or the proven reserves that those Persian Gulf countries do. And let me say one more word about the Persian Gulf, because it will be the center of war again. Now, I was getting ready to say, yes, there might be a war in the Persian Gulf sometime soon. Yes, no, it's going to be again. One of the reasons why the U.S. is has such a vested interest in the Middle East, and the Europeans, and the Japanese, and the rest of the world is because they do affect world economy via oil production. So I've never really bought into the kind of anti-U.S. establishment or anti-Bush folks who are like, oh, we only invaded Iraq for oil. And it's like, well, yeah, no, not really. I mean, it was a consideration, but the U.S. doesn't outright control oil in Iraq. It doesn't control anything in Iran. The Europeans don't control anything in Saudi Arabia, but all of the world is concerned, and so thus there's always global opinion and global policy and maybe even global boots on the ground in the Middle East region to kind of ensure the stability of the flow of oil. And getting back to the geographic point, it's all about the Persian Gulf, because this is kind of the exception. I said there was always an exception to every Middle Eastern homogeneous trait, and the exception here is that the Persian Gulf, jot this down if you don't know this already, the Persian Gulf is the place that has all the oil. The further away you get from the Persian Gulf area, Persian Gulf Basin, the less likely you are to have a tremendous amount of oil. So I've already picked off some of these countries by name. I'll repeat them just so you understand. Saudi Arabia, having the biggest coastline there on this Persian Gulf Basin, probably is the biggest proven oil reserve holder on planet Earth. Kuwait is also in there. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Iraq, Iran. All of these sovereign states I've now named surround the Persian Gulf. And pretty much, I don't know how the depth is, but say like a mile underground all along the entire Persian Gulf basis, and this includes not just the water but on the land, and actually this belt goes underground all the way up through northeastern Iraq. This whole belt is extremely rich in oil. You pretty much go a mile down or 2 miles down, you stick a straw in the ground, and damn oil is coming up, period. It's one of the richest veins of oil on planet Earth that all of these countries tap into. I'm pretty sure if you're in the United Arab Emirates, places like the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, possibly Kuwait, I think every square inch of these small countries is oil territory. I think if you're in your backyard in Kuwait and you fall over with a pitchfork accidentally, it goes in the ground, oil's going to spurt up. It's just that rich in this particular resource. But as you go further and further away from the Persian Gulf, the less and less likelihood you're going to bump into reserves of this size. And what I mean by that is, Egypt has some oil. Yes, they have some. Not nearly as much as Saudi Arabia. Turkey has some. Not nearly as much as Kuwait. Algeria and Libya, they've got a decent little amount, but they're not in the league of those Persian Gulf states. We really, and let me go back a slide, really kind of the main players in all this, to restate maybe for the 5th time, the main oil players in the Middle East and in OPEC, and therefore in the world, are Saudi Arabia, huge reserves, Iraq, UAE, Kuwait, and Iran. There's 5 right there. Won't even go any further, okay? Just those 5 have more reserves than anybody else on the planet. For now. Maybe we're going to see other states climb in their proven reserves, But for now, these 5, and they're all neighbors of each other, control the lion's share of proven reserves. And as I've suggested 20 times, they're major exporters of this resource as well. The U.S. makes a ton of oil. We don't export any of it, so we don't have a say in global prices. Saudi Arabia does. Even Iran does. So, as you get further away from that core, less likelihood you're going to have a lot. Algeria has some. Libya has some. Nowhere near the ballpark of importance or the quantities that we're talking about from the Persian Gulf. Even if you're looking at Iran and Iraq, it's along this seam, all right, the single underwater seam that runs from northeastern Iraq all the way through to the UAE and Oman in this very linear kind of pattern. If you get away from that, even in the eastern side of Iran, there's no oil in eastern Iran. There's not hardly any oil in western Iraq. It's all concentrated in that one seam. Even other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, like Yemen. Yemen doesn't have any oil. It's one of the reasons it's chaos there. They haven't been able to produce a bunch of oil and have a bunch of money to pay off their people and give them benefits and stuff to keep them quiet. They don't have that much oil. They don't have that much capital, therefore. Oman has some, but not as much as others. Is this starting to make sense? But I've talked too much about oil, although you can talk forever about it. It's so important to what's going on in the world. But let's get back to our unifying factors. What other things do you think of when you think of the Middle East? Probably, many of you, maybe you should number one, said, oh, they're Islamic. It's Islam. They're all Muslim. Yes, that is a very good homogeneous trait. It's an excellent homogeneous trait. Really, if you go from Morocco all the way through to Iran, and hell, you could keep on going east from there, it is an overwhelmingly Islamic area. That is a major world religion, major world historical tradition, does predominate in all of the states of the region that we've named. And I'm just showing you some slides here to give you a variety of life in these overwhelmingly Muslim countries. And I keep saying overwhelmingly. It's not that, oh, there's some Muslims there. No, overwhelmingly Islamic states. 80, 85, 90, 99% Islamic states. That is, the inhabitants of these countries would self-identify themselves as, no, I'm Islamic. Again, perhaps no great surprise, but I'm showing you these slides to get you to see a diversity of lifestyle and even dress and the way people look and what they do, because from Morocco to Saudi Arabia all the way through to Iran, these are different cultures, these are different ethnicities, but they all do, and they look differently and they act differently and they dress differently, but they do have a bit of consistency simply because of the Islamic tradition, which is very important in daily life, in political policy, in diet, in architecture, in really everything. However, as I've suggested, different places have different cultures and different people who do interpret Islam a little bit differently. Maybe some are more conservative, maybe some are more traditional. And I did want to just show you some world leaders that you should know for your final exam, just to give you a sense of the difference in Islam, even with political leaders. Now, this is Recep Erdogan. Hopefully everybody knows Recep by now. He is the Prime Minister of Turkey. I don't even include Turkey in the Middle East. Maybe for this reason. They are Islamic, but they're kind of different. They're secular Islamic. So their leader, the leader of their state looks like this. That's Recep Erdogan of Turkey. And another a guy from the Middle East that doesn't look like a traditional Islamist is al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad of Syria, president of Syria. He's got the suit and tie on too. But then you go to Iran right next door, and they are a theocracy, an Islamic republic with a religious cleric as the head of state. Or if you go next door to them, back over to the Arabian Peninsula, it's Saudi Arabia. The king of Saudi Arabia, that's a monarchy. He has a traditional looking dress, but he's not necessarily a religious figure. In fact, he's not a religious figure. He's got the old school king thing going for him. But great variety, even in the leadership. Leadership style, the way they dress, the way they look, but most importantly, the way they behave and the way they run their countries. Great diversity, even though all four of these guys are Islamic. Okay, having said that, let's look at Islam for a minute more. It is a major world tradition. It is the fastest growing world religion in existence today. of the 6.7 billion humans on the planet right now, I believe about 1.5 billion of them would be Islamic, would self-identify themselves as Muslims. Put it in context, that's about how many Christians you have too. But here's a major difference. Christianity as a cultural religious force is actually stagnant to shrinking. Islam as a religious cultural force is growing. The number of inhabitants, or not inhabitants, the number of followers of Islam is getting bigger every year. So we should probably pay attention to this religion and understand it a little bit better, and that's what I want to do. Since we all say, yes, the Middle East is Islamic, all right, let's look at Islam for just a little bit then. And I am not a religious expert, you guys know me, so if I falter along the way, you can hit me up via email or any other way and say, hey, you got this wrong, and I will correct it. So I'm not really going to get into the actual nuts and bolts of all of Islam, but let's look at it from a geographic perspective. This world tradition, major world and growing tradition, did start in the Middle East. It's one of the reasons why we associate Islam with the Middle East. And it started in Mecca and Medina. There was this guy, and he was a guy. He was not a god. That's one of the things that I do understand about Islam that I can pass on to you. Named Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad. Peace be with him. The Prophet Muhammad is a guy who was living about 600 AD. It's before that, but I'm rounding off here. I'm not really that much into knowing exact dates. So 570, 600 AD. Let me stress, AD. So already it's like, hey, that's only about 1,400 years ago. Yes, another thing you should definitely know about Islam is it is the newest major world religion. It's only been around for about 1,400 years. Christianity, a couple thousand. Judaism, maybe 3,000. Hinduism, maybe 4,000. Islam is pretty new on the scene in terms of it being a global, huge, big religion. So about 570, 580, the Prophet Muhammad, living in Medina, or was it Mecca? Again, somebody can check my facts on this one. Was a trader, I believe. All right, he was living an average. He's a good guy, living an average life, but he was called, as religious people are, by a higher power, and went into a cave and chilled out, and actually didn't really speak to God. This is a popular misconception. He didn't have a chat with God like Moses did, but God spoke through him. And it's important to understand the difference here for reasons I'll point out in just a second. God spoke through the Prophet Muhammad, and basically it is the word of God that went through him, and he wrote it all down. And in writing all this down, he was producing the Quran, all right, the most holy religious text of Islam. Now, let me stop for a second. Why would I say it's so important to understand that the Prophet Muhammad didn't talk to God? It wasn't a conversation, that God spoke through him. Because of this. Because this person, Muhammad, was Arabic, spoke Arabic, wrote in Arabic, because he was Arab from the Arabian Peninsula. That's an ethnicity. As God was speaking through him, he was writing all this stuff down in Arabic. Because of that, because what he wrote was the Word of God, not his interpretation of the Word of God, the Quran is treated as the Word of God. And as such, it will always, the only true Quran is in Arabic. Surprise, surprise. Because being the Word of God, it's not really up for interpretation. So you can find a Quran translated into English. You can find a Quran translated into Japanese. However, Islamic people would say that is not a true Quran, because we cannot interpret appropriately what God was saying. And he spoke through this man who wrote it all down. That, in that language, is the only true Quran. And I'm telling you this because pretty much everyone in the world, every Islamic person in the world, can at least read some Arabic because of this fact. Because the true Quran is in Arabic, and therefore if you're going to study the true Quran, which everyone should if you're a true Islamic person, you will be able to read the actual text in the actual language it was written in. That makes sense? So you can go from, hell, southern Spain through the classic Middle East, over to Afghanistan, to India, all the way over to Burma, to Thailand, to Indonesia, the most populous Islamic country on the planet. and you will find people who can at least read, if not speak a little bit of Arabic because of this historic fact. Does that make sense? Again, side note here, the most populous Muslim nation on the planet is Indonesia. It's not any country in the Middle East. Isn't that funny? We all associate, oh, the Middle East, they're all Islamic. Yeah, but they don't have the majority. They're not the biggest single population of Islamic folks. Those titles actually go to places like Indonesia and India. What? Yeah, and Bangladesh. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's get back to the historic translation of what's going on here, though, the historic story. The religion started in Mecca, Medina. That's where it was formed up. And, of course, the Prophet Muhammad then went out and shared his message with everybody. And it wasn't adopted immediately, and I'm not going to get into all the nuts and bolts of the story, but it was adopted, and people rallied to him, and then tribes rallied to him, and then they kind of put together a force that went out and spread the word, and it started kind of an empire. People weren't like forced to convert to Islam or to be slaughtered, quite the contrary actually, but it was kind of a religious force that gained political momentum at the same time. So we don't really think about it, but what this ended up being after the unification of the core group of people is that the religion starts to spread out as an Arab empire spread out with it simultaneously, if that makes any sense. So started around 600 AD in Mecca, Medina, and those are to this day the most holiest cities of Islam, and they both happen to be in Saudi Arabia. Thus, Saudi Arabia is kind of the holiest of holy ground of this major world religion. One of the pillars of Islam, that is one of the things that everybody's supposed to do during their life, is to actually go do this thing called the Hajj, that is the pilgrimage. And that is to go back to Mecca and Medina and do the tour yourself personally. And millions of people every year now do the Hajj in this pilgrimage season. As the numbers of Islamic followers gets up to 2 billion or 3 billion or however many billion in the future, just think about the repercussions of millions and millions and maybe tens of millions of people every year trying to converge onto this place for this religious pilgrimage. It's kind of like Disney World on crack, and it's way more serious and way more stoic because this is a religious thing, a pilgrimage. You're actually doing this to better yourself and respect the religion. It is a major reason why I think way more people should study way more about what's going on in the Middle East. And maybe it's one of the reasons why the word middle is an appropriate thing to tag to this region, because it certainly is the middle of the Islamic religion. There's Islamic folks all over the planet now, but Mecca and Medina actually are the true middle. Because of this one pillar, you're all supposed to go back to this place. Again, for a tour, not to live. All right, but I've gone too far now. Let's get back to the story. The core started up there in the Arabian Peninsula and spreads out, unifies all the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula into this bigger political force that after several hundred years, we can kind of call an Islamic caliphate. I actually like to refer to it more as the Islamic Arab Empire. So again, it's religion, but it's not just religion. It's also that it's this ethnic group of people from this place that build an empire, like so many empires get built all over the place throughout history. And they were really successful. So 600, 700, 800 AD, these guys are just storming and kicking ass and expanding outside of the classic Arabian Peninsula, outside of the classic Middle East. So you take over and unify the Arabian Peninsula, but then you take over places that are now Iran, places that are now Turkey, places that are now North Africa, and indeed, if you see from the map here, places that are now Central Asia, and places that are Spain and Portugal. That's right, the Arab Islamic Empire during its peak took over the Iberian Peninsula. You can go to Spain and Portugal to this day and see, 500, 600, 700-year-old Islamic worship centers and Islamic architecture from this particular era when they were at their peak of power and of their territorial extent. And of course, they took their religion with them in this kind of bigger conquest. Okay, the Arab Islamic Empire will crash and burn about 1000 AD, 1100 AD. Again, the dates are not that radically important. And they crash and burn for all the reasons that all empires eventually crash and burn. And they are replaced by this entity called the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans are not Arab, they're Turks. Ah, Turkey. Yeah, I'm already getting ahead of the story because it's one of the reasons I don't count Turkey as part of the classic Middle East. Ethnically, they're different from other folks in the Middle East. So the Ottoman Turks then take over in about 1300 and 1400, 1500 AD, and they start building their mighty empire. And they keep this religion as the core of their culture as well. So even though the Arab Islamic Empire fades away, the Ottoman Empire very quickly takes its place and keeps this kind of unified culture, political structure, but mostly religious tradition. And the Ottomans expand even further into Europe. The Ottomans at their height were really pressing into Austria and Hungary and had taken over what's now Greece. So this tradition, and again, they take their tradition and their religion with them, has been spread out through Eastern Europe, North Africa, and further afield than that. And let's go ahead and get to that. It is a global tradition. So over the course of the last 1,400 years, Islam has been carried from its core in Saudi Arabia to all parts abroad. I would assume at this point, every single country on earth has some Islamic folks in it. However, this map is just showing you where they are the vast majority. And the vast majority of Middle East is Islamic. So you got that one right. It is a homogeneous trait. And it's a correct homogeneous trait. As I've already pointed out, some of these countries are 99% followers of Islam. Hell, maybe some of them are 100%. Maybe Saudi Arabia's 100%. I just always assume there's always a random stray Christian or somebody hanging out there. But outside of even the core Middle East, all of North Africa is overwhelmingly Islamic. And not just the North Africa part. Islam throughout the last millennia has, through trade and exploration and economic interaction and political interaction, has really spread to big parts of West Africa and all the way down the east coast of Africa through Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania. Coastal Africa down the east coast is largely Islamic as well. But of course, Islam penetrated into all of Central Asia. So all the Stan states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, these are all overwhelmingly Islamic places, as is Pakistan, India, there is an asterisk here after India, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia, places like Indonesia that I've pointed out, is the largest Muslim population on planet Earth. Now, why did I put an asterisk after India? Because, let me reiterate, probably an exam question, the most populous Muslim nations, the biggest populations of Islamic folks on planet Earth are, and I believe this is in order, Indonesia, then who do you think comes next? Saudi Arabia? No. Pakistan? Then who do you think comes next? Saudi Arabia? No. Bangladesh? Okay, who comes next after that? Saudi Arabia? No. India. And in fact, maybe India's number 2. India, you don't think of India as Islamic. They're Hindu, right? Yes. The overwhelming majority of people in India are of the Hindu tradition. But, there are about 20% of the folks in India. Hell, maybe it's only 10, but I think it's 20% of the folks in India are Islamic. Okay, well that's a minority, so no big deal, right? Oh, wait a minute, India has 1.4 billion people. So what's 10% of 1.4 billion people? 140 million people. Okay, so if only 10% of Indians are Islamic, that's 140 million people. I think it's closer to 20%. So that's more like 300 million people. 250 million people, conservatively, in India are Islamic. 250 million people in Hindu India are Islamic. 250 million is a big number. And in fact, I think I did get my facts wrong. I think Indonesia's number 1, but I think India's number 2 for the biggest numbers of Islamic folks. And Pakistan, and then Bangladesh. But I don't know if I've got them in the right order, but I'm telling you, those 4 countries are the most Islamic in terms of having the biggest numbers of Islamic people. And none of them are even in the Middle East. The top 4 aren't even in the Middle East. So keep that in context. This is a global tradition. It's not just Middle Eastern, and the Middle East does not have them all. In fact, they might not even have the majority of the Islamic folks worldwide. Okay, that cool? All right. But what kind of Muslim? Because it gets even more confusing. Oh, it shouldn't be confusing though. This is pretty straightforward stuff. unlike Christianity, which has divisions, Islam has divisions, but they're not ideological divisions. That's kind of what I wanted to stress here.